One of the strangest men inside Hitler's inner circle was Rudolf Hess, a man whose Second World War would be over after he took a plane to Scotland, flying solo in a bizarre attempt to broker peace with the British. However, Hess was immediately arrested, and the Deputy Fuhrer of the Nazi Party would then be imprisoned, and he would spend the rest of his life behind bars. He was known as the last Nazi inside of Spandau Prison, but at the age of 93 he died under circumstances which have been questioned. After his death, the prison was demolished to prevent it becoming a shrine for neo-Nazis, but in the years following, his remains and body were exhumed and dug up, as the authorities in Germany were concerned about activity near to the site of his burial. Join us today as we look at the disturbing exhumation of Rudolf Hess, and to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Rudolf Hess was the Deputy Fuhrer of the Nazi Party, and he was a man who was utterly devoted to Hitler after hearing him speak for the first time in 1920. He was member number 16 of the Nazi Party, and was involved in fundraising to begin with, and was even injured trying to protect Hitler following a bomb which exploded at the Hofbrau house. He was part of the Munich Putsch and had taken a few people hostage and taken them 30 miles away from Munich, but when he left to make a phone call, the hostages then managed to escape. He was sentenced to 18 months in prison for his involvement in the attempted coup, and it was Hess who was involved in writing and editing Hitler's book Mein Kampf. But he was a man who was a keen flyer, and he had a private pilot's license, but inside of the Nazi Party, he rose to the position of Deputy Fuhrer. He was also a Reichsleiter, and was involved in organising the Nuremberg rally, and giving the opening speech, and he would introduce Hitler to the rapturous crowds. But his office was involved in drafting the Nuremberg laws, which imposed strict laws and restrictions on Jews. These rules later resulted in the mass deportations to concentration camps, but Hess was a man motivated by his loyalty to Hitler. He did not want power for himself, but further idolisation for Hitler and the Nazi Party. As the war went on, he became more anti-Semitic, and he believed the Second World War had been caused by Jews, and he would continue to give speeches during the conflict blaming them. But he was a man who was a hypochondriac, and he believed he had many different problems with his health, and when he had meetings with Hitler at the Berghof, he even brought his own food, but Hitler disapproved of this. But as the war progressed, Hess believed he was falling from Hitler's affections, and with this he was worried about a war on two fronts, and he believed it would break Germany, and then he decided to try and negotiate with the British to end hostilities with them. He trained in a Messerschmitt Bf 110, and would take this aircraft on a remarkable flight where he managed to get to Scotland, and he managed to make it within 20 miles of his destination, where he planned to meet with the Duke of Hamilton, believing he would be able to be part of the peace talks. But Hess was captured by members of the Home Guard, and Churchill could not believe that they had captured the Deputy Fuhrer of the Nazi Party. In Germany he was portrayed as a madman who had lost all sense of normality, and Goebbels said in propaganda that he was mentally ill and should never have been in a position of power. Following his capture, Hitler stripped him of all his ranks and ordered him to be executed on sight if he ever set foot in Germany again. Hess told the Duke of Hamilton that he was on a mission of humanity, and that Hitler wanted to end hostilities with Britain, but Hess's flight was announced across the radio, and it caused a huge degree of confusion. After this he was considered a prisoner of war, and he was sent to the Tower of London, the very site where two of Henry VIII's wives lost their heads, and he was then sent to a mansion in Surrey for 13 months. Hess was to be treated well, but he was not allowed to learn about the war, and he was guarded by a huge number of soldiers. He underwent a number of psychological investigations that claimed he was mentally unstable, and his behaviour at times would be irrational. On the 16th of June 1942, he tried to take his own life by rushing guards and jumping over the railings of a staircase, which resulted in him fracturing his leg. Because of this, he was kept under close guard and was transferred to a different hospital facility, where he was kept for 3 years. He was allowed walks on the grounds, but he tried to take his own life again, this time stabbing himself in February 1945 with a bread knife. But after the end of the war and the German surrender, Hess was accused of being a war criminal and was sent to Nuremberg to be part of the Nuremberg Trials. He was charged with 4 crimes: conspiracy to commit crimes, crimes against peace, war crimes and crimes against humanity, but also violating international law. He was a difficult man in captivity and was clearly not right. He began to exhibit amnesia, and he hoped that possibly being insane could result in him avoiding the death penalty. He did have a good defence in the courtroom, and despite the court deliberating for 2 months, he was found guilty on 2 of the 4 counts. Because he was not found guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity, he was saved from the hangman's noose and was instead given a life sentence. Whilst at Spandau Prison, he was under the watchful eyes of rotating guards from the UK, US, France and the Soviet Union. Hess was prisoner number 7, and he would receive only a small amount of paper to write letters with, and he was not allowed to speak with the other Nazis without permission. He was expected to help with chores and was permitted to have an hour's walk in the gardens a day. As time went on, the rules got more relaxed, but Hess was hesitant to allow his family to come and visit. He would cry and wait throughout the night and claim his food was poisoned, but more attempts on his own life came, and he spent the rest of his life at Spandau Prison. The rest of the Nazis were released, but Hess remained inside of Spandau, and despite being the last Nazi and being allowed to do almost what he wanted, he would die within the prison walls. In September 1979, he was suffering from prostate cancer which could have killed him, but he remained a Nazi and refused to apologise for anything he had done. But on the 17th of August 1987, at the age of 93, Hess was found dead in a summer room, inside of the prison garden. It was said he had died using an extension cord over the window latch, and a note was found in his pocket to his family thanking them. But there was much debate about his death, and there was even speculation that it was a body double who died. But this would be disproved using DNA on his remains in 2019. However, Hess, after his death, was initially buried in what was thought to have been a secret location. But this was then found, and neo-Nazis would hold rallies and gatherings around Hess's grave, and because of this he was exhumed for the first time. The former Deputy Fuhrer's remains were dug up in the middle of the night by the authorities, and were then moved to Wunsiedel in Bavaria on the 17th of March 1988, just less than a year since he had died. When his wife died 7 years later, she was also buried with him in this family plot. But the problem still remained about Hess, and his grave yet again became a site of pilgrimage for neo-Nazis, despite his remains being moved once more. Every August on the anniversary of his death, the groups would take a pilgrimage to the gravesite, and demonstrations would take place. Because of the chaos this was causing, the council had agreed not to permit the lease on the grave to be extended when it expired in 2011. Hess had requested in his will to be buried in Wunsiedel, as it was where his family had a holiday home, and also where his parents were already buried. It was a local Lutheran church who had supervised the ceremony, and they initially gave the reburial of Hess, as they said it would have been wrong to ignore the last wishes of a dead man. But as mentioned, the grave became a site of pilgrimage, and Nazi wreaths were laid at the site, and the Hitler salute was performed around his grave. A member of the church council said the whole town was shut down in turmoil, and there was a huge police presence. We here at the graveyard were not able to cope. Because of this, the authorities then decided yet again to exhume and disinter the remains of Rudolf Hess for one final time. The granddaughter of Hess objected that it was wrong to exhume his remains and go against his final wishes. However, the parish council ignored this and went ahead with the exhumation. One resident said, "Perhaps we will now have some peace when he is gone. Perhaps they won't come any more," which is what Wunsiedel wants. Under the cover of darkness, Hess's remains were dug up from the grave in secret, and his grave was opened on the 20th of July 2011. After this, the remains were then transported to a nearby crematorium, where the decaying remains of Rudolf Hess were then cremated and were reduced to ashes. These were given to his family members, who scattered them at sea. The gravestone which contained his name and the German inscription which read, "I have dared," was then broken up and destroyed, removing any reference to Hess in the graveyard. It was confirmed that his grave had been emptied and that his body had been removed from the cemetery to deter Nazis coming back. The deputy mayor later said, "Hopefully we can put this all behind us. We hope the phantom has left." Rudolf Hess is a captivating and interesting figure who was considered to have been the last Nazi. Spandau Prison, where he spent his last 40 years of his life, was later demolished to prevent it being a shrine, but it was a place where Hess's life came to an end. He was a man who was a Deputy Fuhrer, and a man who was loyal to Hitler and was trusted, until his failed flight to Scotland occurred, and he was shunned and portrayed as a man who lost his faculties. His exhumation is one which was caused by threats posed by Nazi groups in Germany decades after the war and the end of the Nazi Party, and Hess's remains were not laid to rest, as each year thousands of people will head to the gravesite to venerate him. But he was a dangerous man, and was someone who was considered a man who could have easily been executed following the Nuremberg Trials, alongside other prominent Nazis. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.